conduct. So Justice Thomas sort of slides past, writing for the court, slides past the whole premise of Hendricks' argument. And notice that. I want you to sort of look for those sorts of, did that really answer the point? Because sometimes courts are very slippery, and judges will not really engage the argument. And when you are practicing law, you will be frustrated by this. You'll be like, but I argued this. And the court seemed to ignore it. Maybe because the court didn't have a particularly good answer. So it just gave its own reasoning. Welcome to the practice of law. Okay?
And he does say that, the criminal conviction is not a prerequisite for the commitment.
Excellent.
Which is, it's difficult to imagine in this kind of case how that would work.
Really?
Because, well, in other cases where people are involuntarily committed, sure, but in this case, how would you know if someone was a pedophile if there had been no criminal acts?
Anyone? You are?
Miss Scowcroft.
Scowcroft, yep.
Yeah. He said in the trial that he most likely to.
But we're assuming, Justice Thomas's point here, that's absolutely right. The point Justice Thomas is making is, this can't be about criminal punishment because civil commitment proceedings could be brought under this statute against someone who had never been convicted in the first place. And the point here is, if that's, how can that possibly be true? And my answer to you is, you need to expand your imagination, right? Because it actually happens frequently, right? Accusations are brought that somebody has committed some sort of sexual violence, and a prosecutor decides, you know what, I don't think I necessarily can prove any of these incidents beyond a reasonable doubt. But what I might be able to prove is the mental condition, because I have psychiatric experts, and I have enough that I can convince a jury that this person's dangerous. So it happens, right? It happens. It is not just a hypothetical possibility.
So what I also got from the justice who was talking was that, let me get my thoughts together. Hold on one second. They were committing him not only, like he was saying, not because of past crime, but to prevent a future crime. And so that's why it wasn't, bad or double jeopardy. And so would people like that, like you just said, it happens all the time with someone who maybe was thinking of planning a mass shooting or something, will we commit that person not based on a past crime because they haven't done it yet, but to prevent a future crime?
It's like a Tom Cruise movie. Where you can predict somebody, some technology that predicts future crimes.
Yeah.
And you send your law enforcement people out to prevent them from ever occurring. I think that's a dangerous slippery slope for this kind of statute and for the court, and because it's one thing when the standard is this is a mental condition that we presumably are diagnosing, asking juries based on testimony from both sides to determine, does this person have this condition that renders them unable to conform their behavior to society's expectations and norms and makes them dangerous. It's another thing when somebody just is alleged to be predisposed by their politics or education or upbringing or life circumstances to be likely to engage in a particular criminal act. Because that starts to get into punishing somebody for something they've never done, and where is the actus reus requirement in that?
Okay.
So once you get into the idea that we're going to deprive somebody of their liberty when there has been no action, I think that's a tougher call. One of the things that anchors this and makes it easier for the court to uphold is this part.
All right.
Yeah.
I have a question about that. So if this person had never been arrested or anything, but I don't know what the duty of disclosure is for like a therapist. If they tell them like, I'm probably going to do this because I don't feel like I can control myself.
Yeah.
Like, at what point does the therapist have an obligation to, or do they not ever have an obligation to interpret it?
They do,
Okay.
under certain circumstances. If they believe that criminal behavior is likely, and it's been disclosed to them, they do have an obligation.
Okay.
And that could be one of the circumstances that contribute this.
I just had some real light commentary, if that's okay. When I was an undergrad, I worked for a firm that was general counsel for a hospital. So we would do these all the time, the involuntary commitments, and like I would see it for things such as like a neurosurgeon's husband goes out and starts buying cars compulsively, and stuff like that. So like anytime you have something real crazy, we would see that go into a 72-hour psychiatric evaluation, and then after that, if we get the judge to sign off, we ship them off, and then it was at the discretion of the asylum, basically asking them to get back out.
Right. It's a really good point that civil commitment, we have a whole civil commitment regime. And one of the points Justice Thomas makes is, if we're going to decide, if we're going to say that that's always punishment, that's always, always renders it criminal for double jeopardy purposes, that can't be. I mean, we've had a long tradition of having civil commitment for situations in which somebody's a danger to themselves or others, and that's a traditional part of our justice system. I won't say criminal justice system. So he says we need some basis for distinguishing that which is criminal, i.e. serves the punitive purposes, and that which is not. And that's the starting point, really, for his analysis. And whether he draws the line in the right place, we can debate, but he says the Kansas statute does not fall on the criminal side of that line.
I have a question about the wording. Something here. It says, unlike a criminal statute, no finding of scienter is required to commit an individual who is found to be a sexually violent predator. Instead, the commitment determination is made based on the mental abnormality, the personality disorder, rather than on one's criminal intent.
Right.
So the word scienter could mean intent or knowledge of wrongdoing.
Right.
So if you have, I get saying no knowledge of wrongdoing. It doesn't have to have been a specific instance. They say you did this, therefore you didn't commit it. But don't you at least have to have? Don't you have to have the intent to do it in order to be committed? Like even verbally to say I want to do this, or to have been planning it and to be caught in the planning of it.
Not necessarily. It is the finding of the existence of the abnormality that triggers the eligibility. Now, as he says, part of the evidence for that can be that you either have committed the act or that you intend to commit the act in the future. But that's not the basis for it. You want to distinguish between something that helps you prove what the state must prove and the actual thing that must be proved, right? Something like intent to commit the act may be evidence that you suffer from the abnormality, but it's the abnormality that is the thing that the jury will be told you must find exists.
So if someone was saying, I like 10-year-old little boys in this way, but they never said they were going to do anything about it, but they just talked about that, that's enough to have them committed.
That would be an issue for the jury to decide. That would be, is the abnormality the fact that you have these ideations, the fact that you have these fantasies, the fact that you may have sort of, whatever the person says or can be shown to exist by whatever evidence is put forward. The fact that somebody accesses a certain kind of pornography or sexually graphic material, whatever the proof is, all of that proof goes before the jury. What they are asked to decide is not, did this person both act and intend to act, but did they have the mental abnormality? All of the other things might be proof of the abnormality, but it's not what the jury is asked to find. Okay, it's a really good question, and something you always want to keep in mind in terms of the difference between what's evidence, what tends to prove a proposition, right? And what the ultimate proposition is that the jury is asked to find. What does the state actually have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt? All right, one last point, and then we're going to move on to Dudley and Stevens.
I was just going to give another clear context.
Sure.
I actually work for a mental health agency, and what we deal with is mental inquest warrants.
Yeah.
And it's anybody in society can put out a mental inquest warrant on anybody else
yes, we have liberty and a fundamental right to liberty that the government cannot violate without due process, but there are mechanisms in place by which that liberty can be limited, and some might argue infringed, for what our legislatures have decided is a sufficient basis, and sometimes for a limited time, like 72 hours, or on sufficient particular grounds. And whether that bleeds over into the criminal law is what's at issue in Congress. Okay? And that brings us to Dudley and Stevens. And it's one of my favorite cases because it really is a great sort of indoctrination to, or introduction into law school, not just criminal law, that what do we do to you on your first week of law school? We give you a case about cannibalism.
And morality.
And morality, okay? So Thomas Dudley and Edward Stevens were indicted for the murder of Richard Parker in July of 1884. What were the circumstances in which this crime, if a crime it was committed? Lots of hands. You are?
Olivia Edwardson.
Edwardson.
Yes.
Is Edwardson, okay? What were the circumstances?
These men were on a ship and there was a storm that came, so they had to board.
This is like the Gilligan's Island
Yes.
of law cases, right?
And they all had to board, I guess, a lifeboat or something like that. And they only had, I think, like really meager portions of turnips.
Turnips, you say?
Yes.
Who would I give the envelope to? You just traded turnips for chocolate. A great deal. A great deal under any circumstances.
Yes.
Now, I want to tell you a little bit about this story. There's a great book, I think it may even be mentioned in the case book, called Custom of the Sea. I have a copy of it upstairs if you're interested in borrowing it. That tells enormous detail about the circumstances of their voyage, of their wreck, and then they're being brought back to England and tried ultimately, and what ended up happening to them. Great book. So let me give you a little details. They were hired, that is Dudley and Stevens and their crewmen, were hired to take this ship, which had been bought by an Australian. It was going to be sailed from England to Australia. And that was one of the stupidest acts ever committed by human beings, who can be, as you know, awfully stupid at times. Okay, because this ship, everyone really knew at the time, there was no chance it could make it to Australia. It was seaworthy for short trips, but the voyage at this time, from England to Australia was dangerous, and this ship was old, and lots of people warned some of the crewmen, don't take this trip, don't do this. But times being what they are, sometimes times are hard, take whatever work you can get, so they took this voyage. And ultimately, this ship, the Mignonette, was wrecked by a very severe storm, and they were cast away at sea, as Ms. Edwardson says, in a lifeboat, 1,600 miles from the Cape of Good Hope, and they have almost no food. As you said, they had some turnips, yum, and they caught a turtle, so that fed them for a while. They could catch some rainwater, but that was, hit and miss, and if you drink seawater, you're in big trouble. Salt water is not a good thing. So they had nothing to eat for 8 days. Then what happened?
I think they were was it near like 2 weeks in or something like that, and they just were famished. And Dudley and Stevens suggested pulling the boy to Brooks, but Brooks didn't consent to that.
Brooks said no. He continually dissented. At one point, they suggested we should draw lots, right, which was part of the normal custom of the sea. And why do you think this book was called, by the way, Custom of the Sea? Seems like an odd name for cannibalism. Yeah.
Well, one of the things you have to keep in mind is that when you are out on the open sea, and to a certain extent this kind of applies in modern day too, you're not necessarily in somebody else's jurisdiction, especially if you're out in the middle of the Atlantic.
That's true, but not what I'm getting at right now.
This kind of thing's happened before.
Yeah.
This has happened frequently. And this is the norm, this is the custom of how sailors handle it. When they are shipwrecked with very little hope of survival, it was well understood that what you did was you resorted to cannibalism. Part of the norm was you would draw lots, right? It's like, well, luck of the draw, I'm dinner. Okay? And Parker ultimately was lying at the bottom of the boat. He was in bad shape. He had drunk some rainwater, some seawater rather. That had sort of weakened him, and he neither participates in any drawing because no drawing exists, nor does he assent to being killed. And
I think it was 4 days before they were rescued, Dudley and Stevens, and told Brooks to just go to sleep. And then Dudley and Stevens murdered him. I think they cut his throat. And so after that, the men, all of the boats included, feasted on his body and his blood until they were rescued.
now, at the time they did this, as it turned out, the court says they probably would not have survived the additional 4 days before they were rescued, which was completely by chance and probably pretty unlikely, but would not have survived those additional 4 days had they not cannibalized Parker. At the same time, they could not have known at the time they did it that they needed to cannibalize Parker because a ship could have been just over the horizon, just around the bend, as by sea terms. Yeah.
So I have a question. Why is Brooks not part of his case? Because even though he dissented to killing, he still ate the boy.
Right. Why do you think that might be? Think like a lawyer. Think like a prosecutor about it. I'm sorry?
Because he wasn't.
No, think more in practical terms.
He was not at all part of the murder. So.
No, you're thinking in terms of law. You're thinking in terms of the law, not the practice of the case.
He had the intent to go.
No, you're still thinking about whether they could convict him.
He didn't kill him, and he also
No.
was the highest risk.
How do you win this case? What do you need to win this case if you're the prosecutors?
It was 2 against 1. You had like no choice. They just
No.
followed.
Is he testifying against?
Yeah, you need a witness. Right? Can I get a witness? Right? Who's gonna tell? If you're gonna convict Dudley and Stevens, you need Brooks on the stand. Right? Sometimes you make deals with witnesses. The least culpable ones, right? The lower people in the chain. So Brooks there were 2 reasons, really. One was they needed Brooks if they were going to prove this case, and but I don't mean to suggest that the whole thing would have been covered up if Brooks hadn't spilled the beans, and therefore they needed his testimony, because it was the custom of the sea. It was well known. So when they got back, they were openly talking about it, not in a way that was bragging, but it was like, yeah, this is what we had to do. But that's a different matter from proving it in court. So Brooks, they're not going to prosecute Brooks because they got nobody if Brooks is also in the dock and subject to the death penalty. Okay? So if prosecutors think about, well, how do I prove my case? Sometimes I might need to not go after one potential person who was involved in order to convict the rest. Okay. So they are charged with murder, Dudley and Stevens. And Lord Coleridge says an interesting thing in summing up the circumstances. He says on page 606, it appears sufficiently that the prisoners were subject to terrible temptation, to sufferings which might break down the bodily power of the strongest man and try the conscience of the best. And try the conscience of the best. Is this what I want to ask you about, and I want us to explore over the next few minutes, is whether, if that is true, this is a proper application of the criminal law. To whom do we want to apply the criminal law, and under what circumstances?
much about a punishment for them specifically, but more like a statement to society, like this is not an acceptable thing. You can't, no matter the circumstances, unless that's self-defense or something, you cannot murder somebody.
And let me quickly address the legal issue, because we're going to talk about necessity later in the semester. And although this case is in the case book, in the necessity section, I don't teach it for that purpose, but let's address that quickly and say that the court says, look, this can't be necessity, because necessity as a justification for what would otherwise be criminal action requires that the threat that gives rise to the necessity involve the behavior of or conduct of the person that you victimize. So it would have to be that Brooks proposed a threat, and therefore they had to act out of necessity to meet that threat in self-defense.
Yeah, but you
And
mean
since-
Parker, right? Parker was the victim.
I'm
of
sorry,
Brooks.
Parker. Yes, Parker. Right? Parker would have had to pose a threat. And since he did not pose the threat, or pose the threat with the circumstances of there being shipwrecked, they have no necessity defense. Okay? But I want to sort of, again, putting that aside, I want to sort of get at what I think is the more fundamental question here is, you only need a defense if your conduct was criminal, right? You only need a defense if your conduct would otherwise be criminal. Do we think that the criminal law should be applied to people who are facing circumstances that even the most reasonable person would act as they did? Or is the criminal law about those who depart from norms and violate standards that we all think we can otherwise abide by?
I think that it should be applied because they went on to say that the court often has to set up these standards that they themselves, most people can't.
I love that quote. That's a Coleridge quote. Where is that in the case?
It was right after the part you just mentioned. It talks about the temptation must have been unbearable.
That we have to apply standards that we ourselves cannot meet. And you agree with that. Anyone else?
Anyone else agree, or just?
Well, anyone else have an opinion about that?
I was just going to say that even though it's those standards are based on still morals, and even though and the laws are still based on morals, and applying those standards are basically following what Lou Shelby just that the morals that we impose upon people are still enacted, no matter what the circumstances are.
And the criminal law should always be in line with morality.
Yeah.
Okay?
So it even says in the case, kind of toward the end, it basically says that by allowing temptation to be an excuse, it's weakening the legal definition of crime itself, which kind of could cause a bigger picture issue in the long run.
Yeah, we're down that, and that's a slippery slope argument. Get used to those. Slippery slope arguments that courts make, and you will want to make when it fits your client's needs, to say, if we do this, if you rule this way, or from the court's point of view, the court could say, if we rule this way, all these awful consequences will follow. We will not be able, because that will start